front of us, it looks like that we now have widespread VAT fraud that allows bad actors to undercut good businesses on the high street. We've got much smaller discounts on business rates than were enjoyed by many retail businesses and hospitality businesses 2 or 3 years ago. And we've got a corporation tax system which frankly looks almost voluntary for many small businesses. So could you just tell us from your point of view, do you think we have a tax system for small businesses that is best for growth?
I think there's a simple answer on that, which is no, but not necessarily for the reasons that you just outlined. So yes, we have a problem with some VAT fraud on high streets. I think the evidence that you heard from previous specialists to this committee in, for example, the beauty industry, it's not just fraud. There are also structures that you can use that are totally legitimate, like a sort of rent-a-chair system in a hairdresser's that would reduce your VAT and make you more competitive. And I think we need to think about why businesses might choose those routes, whether that's because they're scared of the level of admin they will have to do when they engage with HMRC for the first time. And for a lot of them, that is something they are not prepared for, they're not educated for, they don't get the help that they need from HMRC when they do engage. And we know from HMRC
we're going to come on to
that is the case.
Service standards of HMRC shortly, but just focus your energies for a moment on the structure business tax that we've got. Is it optimised for growth?
Again, no, for a few different reasons. One is cliff edges, and the VAT registration threshold we know creates a cliff edge where people simply choose not to get registered and go into that system. They fear the admin burden, as I say, they fear the cost and how that will pass through into prices to their customers, and they will make themselves uncompetitive. The same happens in the business rate system. As you say, reliefs have been slashed, but also there is a cliff edge where you pass over a certain threshold of rateable value. That's the amount that you're paying to rent the space that you're using for your business, and you suddenly have to pay tax on all of that rateable value when you had to pay nothing before. So that can discourage small businesses from expanding into better quality premises, into investing in their premises. It can discourage them from growing to new sites and moving from one site to two because they lose the reliefs at that point as well. It's just not good for very small businesses looking to get bigger. And the same is true with PAYE. We have now got an employment allowance that's gone up last year, but at the same time, NIC's rates went up. So you want to keep your PAYE bill down by hiring fewer people. So you fit below that higher employment allowance rather than having to pay 15% on your PAYE bill above it. So there's lots of reasons why...
There's a catalogue of problems. How damaging is that catalogue of problems for growth?
The thing that's really difficult about giving any kind of numbers or scope on this is how do you check the counterfactual? Which of these businesses would have grown more if they could move to a bigger premises, or they could hire an extra person, or they could go over they could afford to earn more turnover before they hit the VAT threshold, for example? And is that the solution you want? Do you want all businesses to be within the VAT threshold, and so there's no disincentive for them to grow at any point? You know, because we haven't tested any of these outcomes yet, we've always had, or at least for long periods, we've had these different cliff edges in the system.
Why did you say at the top of your answers that the structure that we've got is bad for growth?
Because we can see it in specific bits. So we can see it in the number of businesses that are registered, not registered for VAT, that earn amounts just below the threshold. Yeah. And we actually saw when it went up from 85,000 to 90,000, the businesses who shifted just a few thousand up so they could earn a little more. Yeah. So you can see in that behaviour they're using what they can, and those businesses you could reasonably imagine would have the potential to grow even bigger.
So how clear are the alternatives, and how much consensus is there around alternatives amongst your members at the CBI?
Well, in some areas there's more consensus than others. Yeah. On business rates, for example, we do think we have an answer to that problem about growth, which is moving from a slab system where you hit the cliff edge and everything gets taxed to a slice system like you have in income tax. So the first 15,000 or 10,000 of rateable value is 0%, and then you go into a higher rate above that level. That's how most taxes work. It's how people think most taxes work. If you're using more of an asset and you're able to pay more, then you should pay a bit more, but you shouldn't pay like a whole slab. That we produced a report on that a couple of years ago that had full sort of member support and consensus. It works for small businesses. It works for larger businesses with disparate estates. If you're a Tesco, you might have been consolidating your estate into bigger shops, for example, but this will keep you on the high street and keep you in the Tesco Expresses.
And on VAT reform?
Much less consensus.
Yep.
As you can imagine, there's sort of three categories of business there. There are the people who are, well, and we won't talk about them, so big that their whole supply chain is VAT registered, so this doesn't bother them at all. And then there are the people who are around the VAT threshold, and that's businesses who are over, who might say what you need to do is raise the threshold so that I am out of the system, or they might say you need to drop the threshold so the people I'm competing with are in the system, but you won't get any consensus from the businesses about what the right approach is. Anyone who's currently under the threshold is much more likely to say put it up, because I could earn more and I wouldn't have to worry about it.
Regardless, nonetheless, you think that the way that system operates at the moment is not good for growth?
No.
Okay. Alison, what's your view on whether the business tax system we've got for small businesses good for growth or could be improved?
I mean, I would agree with Alice. Overall, I don't think it is good for growth, and I would agree with a lot of the points, particularly on the VAT system. I think one thing I'd really like to add to that is one of the kind of barriers to growth, if you like, is around a lack of consistency and certainty. It's the message that we get frequently from all sizes of business when we talk about what they want out of a tax system, and it is understanding what they need to do for the medium term, and not having changes sprung on them all the time.
Right, Jonathan, you're the Director General of Customer Strategy and Tax Design at HMRC. We've just heard some pretty compelling evidence that the tax system that we've got at the moment is not great for growth when it comes to small business. Do you think the tax design that we've got at the moment for small business is good for growth, or could it be improved?
Well, I think from our perspective, we're here to administer the tax system as it is. We do advise ministers, and I'm aware, for example, on the VAT threshold, there are competing views on that. I was looking back at some of the evidence around hair and beauty. Again, partly the fact we have a relatively high threshold. We have the sort of I think the highest in the G7, I think joint highest in the OECD compared to other countries. Does mean that, for example, the rent-a-chair model can be sometimes favourable to people, where if there was a lower threshold, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. But again, there are different views on that, on the question of where you put the threshold. As Alice said, other businesses would say actually it needs to be higher, so I've got room to grow before I hit that threshold. So there are arguments on both sides around, say, the VAT threshold. The employment allowance, I can understand businesses thinking about that, but again, the way the employment allowance works is in that slice system. So again, you do not pay employer NICs on the full element of that allowance when you go above it. It's only on the marginal increase. So there are already some elements in there that address some of the concerns we've seen in other taxes where you have slab and slice. But again, this is an area where ministers keep under review the tax system. Growth has been an element that this government has set out in terms of one of its objectives for the tax system.
Happily, we'll have ministers in front of us in due course to answer some of the questions about the judgments that they make. But just in terms of the advice that they receive, is it your view that there are different designs for VAT, the VAT system, that would be better for UK economic growth?
I think these are all trade-offs. So again, the argument is said, you've heard arguments about whether the VAT threshold should be higher, should be lower. There are arguments on both sides of that. Sometimes people have put forward ideas of a taper system where rather than going from no VAT to VAT on everything, you taper it in. But that has the cost of complexity, because that would be a complex system. As you put the VAT taper in, the businesses will need to comply with. So I think there are some sort of trade-offs and issues that need to be addressed, but ultimately they will be decisions for ministers.
In the analysis that your teams have done, have they produced options for VAT reform that would be better for economic growth?
So again, you can see, as Alice has described, a bunching of businesses below the VAT threshold. So again, that is some element of distortion. Whether that's kind of genuine behaviour or reporting behaviour is a bit less clear. But again, what you could see is if you moved that threshold up, you would have some effect, but potentially you only move the bunching up. And of course, with the way the VAT system works, the higher the threshold is, triggering that threshold has a bigger cash hit for you, the higher it is. So again, we have looked and we've seen that bunching, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what the best option is in terms of removing that bunching.
So are you saying to the committee today then that you have not got a clear-cut option in HMRC that would give you a reform of the VAT system that would be better for economic growth than the one we have today?
I think there are options for reform, but at the end of the day, they would be a trade-off. And again, we've not quantified exactly what they would do to economic growth, either from increasing or decreasing the VAT threshold.
Okay. And what are the options for reform?
So I said, I think there are broadly three. You could increase the VAT threshold. You could reduce the VAT threshold. And again, I think one of the interesting things on the VAT threshold is both the financial effect of triggering the VAT threshold, but also the compliance costs, the administrative costs in doing that. And again, I think that's something you could think about. Increasingly, we're seeing businesses using software. So that might, for example, mean that the costs of compliance are perhaps less than they have been in the past when there was a lot of manual processing involved. And I said the third alternative that has been put forward is this idea of a taper. So rather than you go straight at paying 20% VAT or liability for 20% VAT on all of your outputs, you might have something where the first few £1,000s is a lower level than 20%. But the problem with that is complexity and understanding. And as Alice has said, I think part of the challenge here is also having a system that businesses understand that if they make decisions to increase sales or invest, they understand how that will affect their tax.
So there are a range of options for reform, but when Dan Tomlinson asks you a bit later on today which of those are better for economic growth, you can't say, well, Minister, it's A rather than B or C.
Those would be trade-offs for ministers. Different people will have different views about them. So yes, I think there are choices to be made there. And different people will weight them in different ways.
Just in terms of the raw, hard-edged economic modelling, you've not got such modelling that tells you that one option might be better than another for GDP growth.
No, and again, you will hear different views, again, weighting those different elements of whether a higher threshold allows businesses to grow more, but they hit that threshold, or a lower threshold means that more businesses get over that and are therefore no longer constrained by the threshold for their growth. So those are the trade-offs you face.
Amen.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you for that. And I take your point about counterfactuals, but I mean there are lots of countries in the world that have VAT, which are obviously different to the UK, but you know that there is a set of petri dishes which are different but relevant. For Alice or Alison, whoever would like to answer this, I mean, this whole point about data and modelling, who has got, I mean, here we are, you know, doing our best to try and understand, as is the country at the moment, who has got the best data and the best modelling? They don't have to be right, but point us in some directions, that academic, who's, you know, what are the best papers and best bits of work?
So, I really want to point to Jonathan on my right, because HMRC are the people who have the data about individual taxpayers. But I will say on his behalf, and I'm sure he has other views on this, that data will not be complete for a number of reasons. And with VAT in particular, he already highlighted that the gap around who's bunching underneath it. You don't know if that bunching is because the businesses, and we would expect from our membership that this is true for the vast majority, are making a choice. They are getting close to the threshold and just saying, okay, I'm not going to do any more work this year. And if you've ever tried to hire a tradesperson in January or February, you might find it's much tougher than the rest of the year. Or if they are just failing to report that income to HMRC. So those have different outcomes in terms of what the modelling looks like and the growth, because there might be a large grey economy which might shrink if you were to change the VAT thresholds, or those people might bring their income, all of that grey income, into the legitimate economy, and you don't know. Or you might have a large group of people who, the moment that you change the threshold and they don't have to worry about this anymore, whichever way you do that, say, okay, well then I'm not going to stop working in January.
I get that, but you're more expert than we are, so we are looking for your advice as to where to go to have informed opinions and informed information that we can then draw opinions from, who, you know, because people have to make decisions on this, and we need help on that. So tell us where to look, please. There must be somebody who's got some good data and modelling on this.
One of the things that HMRC has done in the last few years, which is really helpful, is to give more of that data to academics. Now, I don't know off the top of my head who you could look at for VAT in particular, but a lot of the data that they have available to them, they are putting into anonymised data banks so that you can look at particular categories of taxpayer in more detail and do that analysis. And the thing that leaps to my mind, if you were interested in high net worth individuals, for example, there's a team at Warwick University under Aaron Advani who've done a lot of work on them. There will be other specialists who've looked at other areas depending on what data is available, but really it depends on who you're talking to and what you want to talk about.
Okay. Alison, any views on how to resolve this in an informed way?
No, I think the data has to come originally from HMRC because they are the people who get it direct at source. So it's then making that available in as open a way as possible, I think, to other people. And we see it even with the tax gap data that we get, that it's not necessarily granular enough to draw a lot of interpretations from it. So the more detail that HMRC can draw out and make public, the easier it is to have an informed conversation about things, I think.
Would you be willing to write us a list as to what you'd like to see?
Yes.
I mean, and Jonathan, would that be something that the HMRC would be willing to?
So we make data available to researchers. I don't know, like Alice, I don't know off the top of my head any particular research that's been done on the VAT threshold using our data, but it's available. But you would think into people like the Institute for Fiscal Studies would look at these sorts of issues. I'm certain actually there are many tax commentators out there who probably also have views on what should happen with that threshold. But again, I don't want to point on particular individuals, but the Institute for Fiscal Studies is often authoritative in its research in many areas.
One thing that we can offer at the CBI that other groups may not be able to is more on the administration side. We know that HMRC tries to do estimates of what it costs a business to design a new system, to implement it. But a lot of what businesses do is actually to collect data and tax for HMRC, and that is the main cost to them. So if you were talking about PAYE or VAT systems, for example, actually most of being in a VAT system is collecting data and tax from your customers to give to HMRC. So the costs of that, quite often HMRC uses a model that we think underestimates those costs, and if you had to use a third-party advisor, for example, doesn't properly model that, and we can get more information from our members because they're more willing to talk to us about that than they may be to talk to HMRC.
Thank you, Chair. Alice, sticking with you for a second, the government have announced changes to business rates recently. What is the CBI's view on those changes announced, and do the CBI think that those changes will make the high streets more advantageous against online competitors?
So we're really pleased to see this government engaging with the idea that the current business rate system does not work, that it needs fundamental reform, but the proposals that we've heard so far to us don't look like fundamental reform. They don't work for businesses that happen to be in large sites. You know, we've got single manufacturing companies that happen to be on one large expensive site, and they will now be paying a higher rate under this change to the £500,000 rateable value threshold that's been introduced. And we also don't think they address the underlying problem. I would agree with previous evidence that's been given to this panel that business rates are not the reason the high street is in trouble, or at least they're not the whole reason. There's much more going on there in terms of like shopper access, in terms of competition, the shift to online shopping for convenience, for price, and there are other things that you could do to solve that problem. Having said that, business rates does block businesses investing and growing, and we've talked a bit about why a slice system would work better for that, particularly for small businesses. We have this example that comes up over and over again of pubs across the street from each other, one of whom has taken the time to invest to make it a nice space to be in, spent a lot of money on redecorating and putting in new pumps. They will then get a revaluation that puts their business rates bill up compared to the guys across the road whose pub is falling apart. So you don't want to have those blockers in the system that discourage investment, especially when we're trying to get to net zero, and property and buildings is a big part of net zero targets. So you need investment in basic things like insulation and new windows and roofs.
So on that, would you support the idea of moving away from a business rate system that talks about property value and moves it towards a land value based system, for example?
That is one option, but I think we think our slice system actually solves a lot of the issues here. You don't have to move to an entirely new model. it would work to be able to look at slices. So it would mean that, as we've already said, if you're a smaller business looking to grow, if you're a business with multiple sites, then you would be better off, and the vast majority of our members who've been involved in that consultation think they would be better off under that system.
Matt Weston.
Supplementary, do you think that the small business rate relief threshold should be increased? Any of you?
We think you should get rid of small business rates relief. We don't think you need it if you have a slice system, because you have a 0% rate that essentially gives most small businesses no tax bill in the first place. So that is our answer on a lot of the smaller reliefs, is if you had this system it would also be simpler, because your zero rate would replace many of the smaller, more complex reliefs. It's easier for businesses to understand. My rateable value is £20,000, £10,000 of that is free of tax.
Thank you. Nicola.
Thank you, Chair. What specific barriers do small businesses face when trying to comply with the tax system, and how can we address them, whether it could be local support or simplification? I'll start with Jonathan and go across.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things we can do. So for some of our regimes, we already have quite a simplified system. So if you are self-employed, you only have to report basically two numbers: your cash income and your cash expenditure. So we've already got some simplified systems in for individuals. The key elements we can then layer on top, I think, are sort of twofold. One is good guidance and good support. Often when people are setting up businesses, they will never had to have dealt with the tax system before. How can we provide guidance and support for them, to make certain they understand how to comply with that with their tax obligations? I think the other aspect that is important is then also where can we offer either digital services or encourage the use of digital services, and we'll probably come on to making tax digital. But part of the aim there is to encourage people to start using accounting software from almost day one of your business. We want you to be using that software. That software is good in terms of tax compliance, because again, rather than just keeping, say, receipts in the proverbial sort of shoebox, you're keeping information on your income and expenditure more regularly. That will help you comply with your tax obligations. Also, what we found from when we've introduced Making Tax Digital for VAT is businesses also reported it gave them a better understanding of their business. So for us, it's simplification where we can, and as I said, for the self-employed, it can be relatively simple if you have a simple tax affairs. It's guidance and support to help people to get things right, and then it's digital tools, whether that's tools provided by HMRC or where we're seeing a real growth is in third-party software that helps people get their tax affairs right, but also helps them manage their business.
A follow-up question. In terms of digital literacy, there is high levels of digital literacy that needs to be addressed. Do the HMRC have got any plans to sort of tackle that, any programmes that they are willing to roll out, or any localised support they're wanting to give out to certain maybe areas that are particularly are struggling with complying with their tax?
Yeah. So we generally see quite high willingness of individuals to use digital services. So if we take the population as a whole, you would say 80% of people are willing to try use digital services, but often they need reassurance to use it. So some of that is about design. You know, if I've filed my tax return, how do I know it's been filed? So, you know, we can provide reassurance through that. We do also, and we have been trialling efforts where we use our call centre staff not just to answer immediate questions, but actually to coach people to use digital services in the future. You know, you phoned up this time, but would you like us to help you set up a digital account for the future? So we are moving in that direction, but actually we're a long way from sort of reaching the limits, I think, of digitalisation. So there's a long way to go before we get to, I think, to sort of the digitally excluded. But we are thinking about how we help and support those. And of course, there will always be a need for example, the phones for people who are digitally excluded or for other reasons need extra support. Perhaps they've got a very complicated query. We know we will still need to offer phones to those, but we think there's a lot further we can go with our digital journey.
We know that actually looking at the stats, making this tax digital, there's a high levels of percentage of small businesses that are just simply not using the new software and still having to ring up. So how do you see that being addressed? You know, you're saying that there's going to be the sore phone system, but it doesn't address the fact that those people that have got struggles, that have got disabilities, or those that aren't, as like I said, digital literate. How do we get access? Because the problem is there's not enough people complying with this, and small businesses are costing the economy large lumps of money that could be used back into our economy, but they're not.
Yeah. So again, we're on a journey, to use a term. So we are. You know, we have introduced Making Tax Digital for VAT, so that is how businesses are interacting with us through software for VAT, and that's working very, very, very well. I'm certain there are some groups where we've had to make exceptions, so I think there are around 20,000 businesses who said that they were digitally excluded and they needed to be given an alternative service. So where that has happened, I think we have done that. Making Tax Digital for income tax is now being rolled out over 3 years. We've got a phased introduction of that. Again, if you are digitally excluded, there will be an opportunity for people to opt out of that. They will be able to get support from HMRC, either through our digital channels if they can use them, or by phone if they need to. So we need to go down that route of gradual improvements in our digital service. And also, over time, we're finding new ways of delivering our digital service. One of the areas that's it's primarily not aimed at individuals rather than businesses, but is our app on our phone. That is getting very, very high levels of take-up, very, very high levels of customer satisfaction. So I think it's about both improving our digital offering, but also rolling it out gradually over time and having good routes for people who are digitally excluded.
Okay.
Alice and Alison, can I get you to go to the original question, which is what specific barriers there are to complying with tax and how we can actually simplify it?
So I think we would agree with HMRC that digitisation is really the way to go, that doing everything on paper increases the likelihood of errors, increases the likelihood of not having good records, takes a lot more time to do your administration if you're doing it that way, and we've seen evidence that you could have productivity gains of just under 12% for businesses who move onto a digital system. There's also a first adopter barrier there. Once you've moved onto a system for tax, you might find that you then find it easier to bring in more sophisticated digital systems for other parts of your business, because that initial fear of implementation and training and how you work everything through in your business has potentially been breached. So there's wider benefits potentially as well of digital tax sort of software. I don't think Jonathan's being deliberately disingenuous, but it is a bit of an oversimplification to say that you simply put in your income and your expenses. You have to know which expenses are allowable, which they're not the same ones necessarily for your tax as for your accounts. You need to understand why there's a difference. You need to report it all correctly. Even if you use an advisor and you have the ability to do that, you're still personally liable if you get it wrong. So for a lot of people, if you're a very small business in particular, you're a one-man band or 1 or 2, 3 people, it can be really, really stressful, the idea of getting that wrong. And the more guidance you get, the more support you get from HMRC, the better. And we know that HMRC's call answer rate has been improving, but just taking all the calls doesn't mean you're actually answering all the queries. And the fact that the complaints rate is up about 10% to the adjudicator in the last year, from about 950 to I think it's just over 1,040. It is a sign that there's still problems there and people are not accessing the support they need at the moment from HMRC. And when we come to making tax digital, particularly for income tax, there's a couple of things there. The first is, if you're a big enough business that you're already making tax digital for VAT, you're doing quarterly reporting, and it's unclear why you should have to use a different system and a different set of software to do a different type of quarterly reporting for your income tax. So one big simplification that we'd like to see is those two systems working together so that you can do one set of reporting that covers both. And that would be a big step for HMRC to do, but it would be really positive for those businesses who are already over the threshold or getting close and might want to voluntarily register for VAT, because you can do that from any level. The other is quarterly reporting for the people who are not within the VAT system is going to be a very new thing. And when we talk about a phased introduction, it's businesses who have £50,000 worth of income from next April, then 30,000 the year after, and then potentially 20,000 the year after that. That is a very fast turnaround to be bringing so many people into a quarterly reporting system when we don't even have the software out there yet for them to be using. We only had a sort of potential list published a couple of weeks ago. So even if you're the most informed, prepared small business in the world, your advisors have let you know this is coming, you're looking at these software options, you haven't implemented it yet, and you've now basically got about 6 months to get everything ready to go to be able to report from April next year. And there'll be a lot of businesses who are not in that place, they're not ready. So what we'd like to see from HMRC, we were originally calling for them to drop quarterly reporting, and we understand that's not going to happen now. What we're now calling for is a much longer tail in terms of the soft landing. We need HMRC to be willing to work with businesses over the next few years to make sure the system works. We'd really like to see that introduction to smaller businesses pushed out so we have time to get the group of over 50,000 right and get the system working. There will be bits that we just don't know there are problems until it's been implemented for a bit of time. So that is something we really need to be doing, is getting Making Tax Digital for income tax right for one group before we extend it to anyone else.
I'm slightly against this, so I'm going to speed up a little bit.
Great. Yeah, just actually to Jonathan, just picking up on something else said on customer service. And this committee has heard, and I hear when I go to small businesses around my constituency, that they have often a nightmare dealing with HMRC. These are businesses who are trying to do the right thing, but either can't get through to someone, or when they do, they don't get the answers they need. Do they end up submitting on a wing and a prayer that they've done the right thing? So firstly, do you think we do need to fix your customer service? And secondly, if you do, what are you doing to fix it? And thirdly, when will you be back here to tell us that those improvements have been made?
So we are on a path to improving our customer service. So if I was sitting here, say 12, 15 months ago, one of the key metric we use is how many times people phone us and want to speak to an advisor, how many of those calls get through.
Yeah.
If I was here 12, 15 months ago, we would be talking about numbers about 50%. 50.
And only half of people.
Only half of people getting through. Over the last year or so, we've made substantial improvements. Our target is for 85%. That's what we're funded now to do. We are pretty close to those levels at the moment. I think we're about 83% in the latest area. Just to give you what a sense that translates to, that means the average wait time is about 13 minutes. Around half of calls are answered in under 10 minutes. That's where we are now. But obviously, that's an average across all customers, across all different customer queries they might have, and across all time periods. And we know at certain times there is still pressure on those. So we think our the basic level is getting there. So I'm hoping we will start to see some of those improvements mean fewer complaints. Many of our complaints that Alice was talking about was about timeliness. So we're hoping we are getting better there, and it then allows us to focus on other issues with, for example, are we helping customers in the way they want? Are we able to answer their queries? We've also seen, for example, the length of time we're on the phone with somebody also go up, and we need to understand, is that because we're now dealing with more complex queries, or are there some other problems that mean that we're taking longer because we're struggling to deal with a particular query? So I'm hoping our basic services standards are improving, and from that allows us to then address other issues. If we're not answering the phones in the way people want, actually that's the sort of cornerstone of what you need to build on.
When can we expect then understanding of the quality of the conversation? And being where that needs to be.
So again, now we are pretty much back to where we are. We can start to do that work. We collect customer satisfaction scores, so that's a key element of and we have a feedback form, so we allow people to give us feedback. It's that analysis that then allows us to understand what is going on with that query. Sometimes there are challenges. We know, for example, one of the reasons people phone us is that they would like their repayment, if there's a repayment due. Now, sometimes most of our repayments we're able to make very quickly, but sometimes there are extra checks that need to be made for security reasons, counter fraud checks, those sorts of things. But now we've got back to that level, we will then be able to look at the evidence underpinning that about whether we're actually meeting people's needs when they actually get through on the phone.
Well, we'll follow up on that. Just to follow up on my colleague Sonia's points on digital services. One of the things I know the government's pushing is AI for small businesses and e-invoicing, potentially part of that. My understanding is that HMRC is looking at e-invoicing, whether that should be mandated. Now, my view is that it will not have the benefits to SME productivity and to drive down late payments unless it is. Do you agree with that?
I think that's the direction we are moving in towards thinking about mandation. But then there's a lot of different flavours of that mandation. And you're right, actually, the benefits come because it's not just you as issuing the invoice, but it's also the person receiving the invoice. So sometimes the benefits are to the person on the other end of the transaction. So therefore, there's a bit of a risk that if you just left it purely voluntary, you wouldn't get the take-up you need. So I very much agree with that. I think
whatever you would go for would be mandated.
That's the direction. That's certainly the direction of travel. But then the question is do we get copies of every invoice, or do actually we go for a distributed model where we allow the invoice to be held by the business or by the software provider, and then we almost go out to check the invoices rather than being sent to us. So there's a lot of elements in this. There's also a lot of sort of subtlety about how you might introduce it. In many ways, the tax bit is probably the bit that comes last. You probably introduce the e-invoicing, get businesses doing it first, and then we think about the tax consequences, or bring that into the tax system a little bit later. So again, there's lots of issues here about how we work with businesses on that. We also recognise that even if it's going to be a benefit in the long term, as Alice will probably recognise, there's also an upfront cost of making that change, of changing your processes. So we need to be mindful of that as well. So we think there's a lot of advantages, both for businesses and for the tax system in e-invoicing, but it needs to be approached in quite a sensitive and thoughtful way, learning international lessons as well.
Given what's at stake in these phone calls, which is generally people owe the taxpayer money or they need money back, why is the target 85% and not 100%?
So that is the agreement we've reached with the Treasury about where we are. That is the level we are funded to.
You're not funded to answer 100% of phone calls?
No, we are funded, and again, every extra percent of calls you want to deal with becomes more challenging, because again, you have to deal with calls at any particular point during the working day. We have peaks through the year that are problematic. But that's where our funding level allows us to get to.
Help us understand that then. So per year then, how many phone calls, if you took last year's volumes, how many phone calls would go unanswered if there were 15% of calls that didn't get picked up?
At my own, off the top of my head, we're talking maybe 3 or 4 million calls, potentially. I'm just trying to think through how the numbers flow through our system, because they are triaged and people are allowed to sort of work out what they want to do, whether they want to wait for somebody or not. But of those people who indicate, it's probably sort of 3 to 4 million calls that go unanswered.
Go unanswered?
Yes.
3 to 4 million calls that go unanswered?
Yes, that's the sort of level we're talking about, yeah.
And can I add to that one of the ways that HMRC increased its call target was to move the people who were working on responding to written correspondence into the call centres at the highest point of issue in the year, which I believe is around January time when the self-assessments come in. So there was then a backlog of written correspondence that needed dealing with that was all delayed. So it's not a
often we're lost for words on this
solution.
committee, but 3 to 4 million calls unanswered is quite surprising.
I would have to confirm that that's the right number, but that's the ballpark.
Sure. Even if it is a rough estimate, it's still a horrifically high estimate. Mr. Maynard, this may explain the answer to your question. But
I'm going to ask about the tax gap, which is the gap between what the HMRC should collect and what tax it actually collects. And the small business tax gap has rocketed. I'm going to read something out which says 40% of corporation tax due from small business was not paid in 2023-2024. Of small business was responsible for a tax gap of 28 billion. And if the small business tax gap was the same as the mid-sized business tax gap, i.e. much lower, HMRC would have collected an additional 15 billion every year. Which is, when we talk about 22 billion tax holes and things like that, this is really chunky. And it's really gone up in the last 10 years. So why has it gone up so much in the last 10 years, and what are we doing about it?
Part of the reason for it going up is us better understanding the problem. We've got better measurement, but I would not say better measurement is the whole issue. We are seeing underlying worsening of the tax gap for small businesses. Some of that is a growth in the number of small businesses. We've seen a large increase in the number of corporation tax registered small businesses. So some of it is just literally sort of changes in the population. What causes it is basically three things. One, businesses underreporting income or over-reporting expenses. And for those who are incorporated, it is people sometimes withdrawing money from the company without declaring it as a dividend. That's broadly it's a bit more complicated than that. But those are the challenges. And part of the reason, for example, for introducing making tax digital for income tax is for those self-employed part of that population. What we find is a big contributor is poor record keeping. Back to the people, if they're self-employed, do they keep their receipts in a shoebox? Not all the receipts make it into the shoebox. That is a problem. So what we want is improved business accounting or reporting of and record keeping, and that's the direction of travel there, to reduce that risk of people missing income or getting their expenses wrong.
Just thinking through sticks, carrots, and nudges. Kind of how active are you on kind of the nudges in terms of just because there are ways we can tip people into doing sensible things. Is that something?
Yeah, so it is. So at a much more detailed level, we will go through our processes one by one and look at where there are problems. So one of our issues we found with small businesses was claiming a national insurance relief they weren't eligible for. So instead of just saying, are you eligible for this relief, we put some questions in the electronic form that allowed us to make certain we got people through to the right answer. So we are very keen to do that. We're also thinking about how we use third-party data to better understand what people are telling us. So at the moment we do have access, for example, to merchant acquirer data, so that's credit card data, so we can look at those sorts of things. But increasingly we would like to use that to nudge people and say, well, actually we have some evidence here that are you certain that's your the right number? And part of using software is we can actually build those nudges in real time. You're entering something into the system, we can nudge you and say that doesn't appear right, or this doesn't appear consistent with other information. Do you want to check this answer before you submit it? So we're very keen to go down that route. And one of the challenges, with the very large populations we're talking about, our traditional compliance techniques of visits from tax inspectors are never going to be really, yes, we will do them, but they will never cover a very substantial proportion of the population. So we need to use exactly those techniques of nudging, prompting, building good processes in to the system. At the moment, with self-assessment, you can have 21, 22-month lags in the system, and that does create real problems for individuals. And that's why we are encouraging the use of software and those sorts of things, because better record keeping will help really with that tax compliance. So hopefully that gives you a sense of where we're trying to get to.
Move fast, I think, given that ramp.
and again, I think there is a trade-off here, as we've heard, from Alice. We want to move to digital, but there is a question of the pace of doing that. We would like to go there quickly from a compliance point of view, but we know from businesses' point of view, this is a big change for them using software. So we need to really balance those.
£15 billion, though, that is a lot of money to leave on the table.
No, it is.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. A question to each of you, perhaps I'll start with Alison Kerry. If the government could make just one change to the tax system for the benefit of small businesses, what would it be, and how would it help SMEs?
I think the thing that would make the biggest change that I can see is possibly too much to say to stop tinkering with the tax system and give people the certainty. But actually, if government is thinking of making a change, to think about that change from an end user point of view. So, small business, large business, whatever size, and actually think about how is this going to land with that business? What problems is it going to create for them? What costs, genuinely what costs? So improve the cost model and the assessment of it, and think really about what that impact is, and then try and design a change. It can't take away difficulty for businesses, but you can minimise that and make it more likely that benefits are realised. I think too often we see costs underestimated and businesses unable to actually get hold of the benefits, particularly around digital, if they're not particularly digitally aware at the start. They're the ones you see incurring more cost. They're the ones you then see don't realising the benefits, or it taking longer to realise the benefits. So really thinking it through would be what I would ask for.
Thank you. Alice Jeffries.
Can I have two? One for small businesses, one for micro. Small businesses, we know that HMRC are looking at fixing their corporation tax systems. Given that's the biggest bit of the small business tax gap, that's what we want to see them moving forwards really, really fast.
What change do you want to see to that?
So we want the system to be better built to bring companies into it. So linking into pain points, better software that's cheap and available to them without them having to spend a lot of time doing training, and that links up with their existing software on VAT or income tax as it's coming in. We would just like to see those systems all linked together, and we know that redesigning the corporation tax systems is a big part of what's coming, so that's something we're really looking forward to working with HMRC on. So can
I just ask on that, so would your intention be that actually most small rather than micro businesses could just use an accountant once a year, and really the rest of the time they'll be able to manage their affairs themselves using this software?
It won't necessarily be once a year. You might have quarterly reporting and you have to get that right, but it should be something that is easy to do day to day. You might have seen sort of adverts for some of the software providers where you can sort of take a picture of your paper invoices, and that all then feeds through into a system which connects into HMRC. That is how some of the VAT systems already work. We'd like to see income tax and corporation tax linked in to that, so it all works. As a business, you only have to do one set of things to achieve the outcomes you need and to get your tax right. The micro business piece is that there were about 400,000 penalty notices issued to people for late filing over a 4-year period between 2018 and 2023 for people who have no tax to pay. So they were issued a £100 penalty when they had no tax to pay. And HMRC are addressing this through making tax digital for income tax for people who are coming into that regime. So that's people with businesses worth £50,000 or more. But for the lowest income people, the people who can't afford to pay that money, they are still going to be subject to that £100 penalty. And sometimes we've seen those people, you might have mental illness, you might have very, very low incomes, you might have difficult circumstances in terms of them receiving the paper bills, and that debt can then mount. And it's all coming from a situation where they don't owe the taxpayer, the tax authority, anything. So for that group of people who might have a side hustle, they might have a part-time job, they might be on a 0-hours contract, they're earning a little bit of money, but they not enough to pay tax, we want those penalties abolished.
So how do you make sure that you're getting the right people the right people are paying tax, but as you say, we're not actually sending forget the penalties, we should be sending those
simply
notices.
For this group who don't have tax to pay. You can definitely send them a letter saying you didn't file your tax return on time, but you don't need to then charge them £100 for the data that you're receiving late, essentially.
And Jonathan?
I fear my advice on the tax system is probably best directed to the Chancellor, so if I can be a bit slightly unhelpful in that regard. I think the key thing I would say is our direction of travel for administration is very much in the direction Alice has suggested, that we would like almost tax to be built into many of the systems people already use. If I look at PAYE, and I'm certain if there's payroll providers around, they would say it's probably a bit more complicated than this. But payroll is there, and almost PAYE, the tax becomes a consequence of running the payroll system. We would like the accounting software businesses are using to capture receipts to be doing a lot more of the heavy lifting for tax for taxpayers. But I won't get into tax policy, as I said. That probably is best for the Chancellor.
That brings us to the end of our time. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. That has been both slightly horrifying but also slightly illuminating. That concludes this panel. Order. Thank you very much. Order. Welcome to the second panel in today's Business and Trade Committee hearings on small business policy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us to give us some perspectives on energy bills. Gregor Poynton is going to kick off the questioning.
Great, thanks. We'll start with Chris and move our way along. This committee has heard that many small businesses think they're cash cows for the energy companies because the bills are so high. And I know from speaking to many small businesses in my constituency, energy bills are absolutely crushing them. Can I ask why that is and what you're doing to fix it?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee in this important inquiry. It's true to say that energy bills are 70% higher than that which they were before the energy crisis. And certainly many of the 350,000 small businesses that we serve tell us every day that they are struggling with the cost of energy. It's important perhaps in terms of the breakdown of a standard electricity bill, which is the bulk of the cost. The retailer's costs are roughly 15% of that bill. The thing that's driving, which has remained stable over a number of years now, the thing that is driving energy prices, two things. One is the wholesale price of energy, in particular the marginal pricing, and secondly is the increase in non-commodity costs. Non-commodity costs are made up of two things, network charges and in particular policy costs. We've seen increases in policy costs. The wholesale price makes up nearly 30% of the bill. Non-commodity costs, around 45% of the bill, of which 25% is made up of policy costs. And that's where, to bring bills down for small businesses that are struggling, we need the support of policymakers. We are not, at E.ON, an upstream power generator. We are a retailer. To bring energy prices down for small businesses, we need to work with policymakers to address marginal pricing, bring the wholesale costs down, and to move some of the legacy policy costs off the energy bill into general taxation.
So if I'm right in saying then, you're saying 50%, you're responsible, 85%, 50%, 1.5. What are you doing with that 1.5%?
On the 15%, the average profitability on a small business account for us in our book is £269 per annum. 20 to 25% of our small business accounts are loss-making. We have £400 million worth of energy debt in our SME segment on our books today. To support small businesses, we wrote off £114 million worth of energy debt in 2024. We invest nearly £20 million a year in a dedicated support team that is there to support small businesses, connect them with third parties where they're struggling with energy costs. And in terms of the ability to affect the 15% and to bring some of that margin down, then we offer for free all small businesses who are with us a product called Optimum, which enables them to visualize their energy consumption to help them reduce their energy consumption where that's possible. Where I think we have to get better, and we are improving, but we have to get better, is in looking in the risk premiums that we apply in our contracts to make those more bespoke, more focused on the individual business rather than overweight on a sectoral view of credit risk, so that we are rewarding those small businesses that are well run and well managed with the best price that we possibly can.
When can we expect to see these changes come in? Because some of these small businesses, they say this is life or death for them.
We continue to make these changes. So the product that I described that helps small businesses visualise their energy bills and reduce their consumption is available today. We are one of the businesses in the sector where we assess credit risk based on the individual business's circumstances, and that plays into the tariff that we're able to offer. We are continue to improve the way we use our hedging capability to offer small businesses contracts over 2-3 years where we are hedging and taking significant risk in the wholesale market on behalf of those businesses. We do need help, and we would welcome the support of this committee on the role that commercial landlords play. What we often find, so we have actively brought we actively bring small businesses off expensive deemed rates onto fixed products. Only 9% of our customers are on a deemed rate versus an industry average of 13%. We continue to do that. But the role that a commercial landlord plays in the change of tenancy there is really important. The average time it takes us to get change of tenancy data is 120 days. And that is one of the reasons why you see small businesses sitting on more expensive deemed rates for longer than they should, because we simply don't know who the new occupant of the building is.
Within the table on that, bills are high. What can we do to fix it?
I think there's a number of things that can be done with the non-domestic market, but specifically with billing, it's the number of complaints that Citizens Advice receives from small businesses comes from inaccurate billing, but also not understanding their bills. So we found that 75% of small and micro businesses say they experience some sort of billing issue in the past 12 months, with 41% struggling to even understand.
Down on the numbers, please.
Apologies. So 75% of small and micro businesses say they experience some sort of billing issue in the past 12 months. From that, 41% struggle to understand the breakdown of even the bill. So I think that should be a priority, because even if you're looking at high cost, if you have small businesses with limited capacity and limited resources to basically understand what they're being charged for, that should be, an issue that should be resolved quite quickly.
Thank you. So echoing a lot of what Chris said, I think he articulated really well the wholesale costs and the levies, the non-commodity costs. We're also going to be seeing more of those being added to bills, and I think we have an opportunity right now to have an honest conversation with government about how we spread the cost of that. So we'll be seeing a hydrogen levy, a nuclear funding levy, and other various, so the nuclear RAB, the network charging compensation, hydrogen levy will all be coming on to business bills as well, pushing prices up further. I think amongst all of this, we have to really recognise the essential role energy plays in the economy. At the height of the crisis, when inflation topped 10%, energy costs directly caused about a third of that rise. And I think the impact was close to sort of 40-45% increase in the prices people paid because of the cost of energy. We have to recognise that actually our reliance on volatile gas, it sets the marginal price. We need to be moving towards a clean energy system. So whilst the clean energy system is of course the goal, it will in the long term bring down prices, we have to pay for that somehow, and that is why we're having all these extra costs put on. So it comes down to that big picture conversation about what's fairest on taxes versus what's on bills. In terms of that pot of levies and different costs that are on bills and make up sort of half of the bill, there are a few things that could be considered. One would be removing some of the legacy policy costs. So the renewables obligation and the feed-in tariff still sit on energy bills. Those could be moved into either general taxation or another structure. As the grid decarbonises, they're quite expensive. You could also lower the climate change levy. And also, I think you'd need to pay for it, right? So there are things that could be done, particularly around hypothecating the carbon border adjustment mechanism or the emissions trading scheme, where you'll be getting money in, so you could hypothecate that to trade off the savings. So the reason I put these things to you is because I do think there are things that can be done to bring bills down now while still aiming for a clean power system, because in the long term it will be clean power that will deliver cheaper bills more consistently.
And just walk us through what's happened to the profitability of energy companies amongst your membership.
So Energy UK represents generators of all sorts. We're tech agnostic. We've got gas, nuclear, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar. We've got the retailers as well. In the domestic retail side, for over 4 years, £4 billion plus of losses were made, and it's not a very attractive investment proposition on the retail side. On the non-domestic retail side, the latest data I've seen is it's not a hugely profitable part of the energy market. As an industry as a whole, non-domestic energy suppliers make between 1% and 4% as a profit. So it's not huge. It's not a hugely attractive part of the market.
And how's it changed over the last 3 or 4 years?
I think it has become more complex, I think, since the energy crisis.
In terms of the margins?
The margins, not really.
As in they haven't changed?
No, but I would double check and come back to you. The latest figures I've seen are some analysis done last year, so I'll come back to you and confirm. I'll put that in writing to you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Dara, if I can stick with you, is this the kind of dirty little secret at the heart of the green, clean energy system, is that in fact it's not really wholesale gas prices that are hitting people in the pocket, it's actually all these levies that are being loaded on? Is that not really the case? And we can argue the toss about whether or not we have to go down this route, but short term that's the problem, isn't it?
I think that we have to invest in our system. So I don't think I would characterise it in the same way as you, but I think we do need an honest conversation about the impact that these costs have on bills and the fairest way to pay for them. There are pros and cons for things being on taxation versus on bills, particularly because ultimately it's very regressive having it on, particularly on household bills, of course, but on business bills too, it's regressive. But on the other hand, politics can change so many of these big decisions, and when we're investing in clean power infrastructure and in power generation, investment has long-term horizons, and so you need that multi-parliament view, and so sometimes paying for things via bills is the fairest because you get the longevity. A good example is when we, forgive my language please Chair, but when we cut the green crap, it had a huge impact because actually it was a government decision, whereas ECO, which is the energy company obligation which sits on the bill, continued. It's been the only part of the energy efficiency story that we can actually be proud of as a country because it's continued to deliver, because it was in some way shielded from political intervention, whereas all the other support for households to decarbonise wasn't. So it's just a really good example of how we need to get it right between bills and taxes. It's complicated. No one pretended it was easy, but we do need to invest.
It's easy to be done by now, which is the hard things that we're here for. And Chris, if I come to you, you did a very good job there of outlining the impact of non-commodity costs. Standing charges are another part of that. So do we need a big conversation about this whole question of these non-commodity charges in all their shapes and forms?
I think that non-commodity costs, are, and as I said earlier, non-commodity costs are a significant and increasing part of the bill, and as Dara says, as we invest in the energy infrastructure that we need in this country, and then those non-commodity costs will continue to grow. I think, as Dara's outlined very eloquently, there is optionality in terms of whether you carry those non-commodity costs on the energy bill or whether you move them into general taxation. In other markets in which we operate in most European markets, in other markets in which we operate, then many of the policy costs, particularly the type of legacy policy costs that Dara is referring to there, are not necessarily carried on the energy bill, and if they are, then they are not carried on the energy bill that's on business energy bills. So I think there is good reason to have a debate about what these costs are for, how they're borne, and where the best place to allocate these costs in the various funding mechanisms is.
Are you able to give us a cross-country breakdown of those bills for, say, a typical business in the different European markets you operate in?
If it's okay, Chairman, I will write to the committee with that, absolutely. Yeah. It would be wrong to try and do it off the top of my head today.
It would be very helpful just to help us understand what's going on. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. If I can come to you, you talked about the difficulties that businesses face understanding their bills. Do you think there's more could be done with the bills? Would it be easier to explain the bill when HMRC tell you how much you've paid, you get a breakdown on what your money's going to and things like that? Would it be helpful if that was simplified? Might perhaps that better communication, would that help businesses understand what's going on with their bills?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of the two. One of just a standard explanation, right? Every supplier has different bills, different sort of process, how they lay out those bills. So having something more standardized would definitely be helpful, but also, yes, just communication. A lot of small businesses and micro businesses navigate the energy market the way normal domestic consumers do, again, because of that limited resource and limited capacity. And so having more support even by the government to kind of clarify what their rights are, and especially around billing would be tremendously helpful. Just going back on even the net zero point, if we are to have a quick transition or easy transition, that small businesses need to be able to trust their suppliers, and if they're not getting accurate bills, that can also lead to mistrust in the market and mistrust in suppliers. So there's a trickle-down effect of why the billing issue is so massive.
It seems to me that domestic customers are better treated than commercial customers in this, that domestic customers have several checks and balances and safety nets in place, whereas
definitely, yeah.
the commercial people are just out there on their own.
Absolutely, there's definitely a lot more protection for domestic consumers than there are for non-domestic and for small businesses. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more that Ofgem needs, the capabilities and the powers to actually do a lot more to protect small businesses.
Okay, so do you think it's Ofgem doesn't have sufficient powers, or it has the powers, and again we've heard a lot in this committee about paper tigers. It looks great on paper, but they're not enforcing that. Where do you think Ofgem are? Do they need more powers, or do they just need to use what they've got?
I think a combination of both. I think there has to be more that is done with the powers that are there, more clarity, more standardization that could be done, especially without through SLCs. However, yes, there is more that perhaps the government can give to Ofgem to better regulate the industry.
Thank you.
Matt Weston. Thank you, Chair. We conducted a whole series of roundtables back in December last year. Went around the country and talked to all sides of businesses. And what was striking really for small businesses, and particularly in the hospitality sector, was just how much they felt they were paying too much for their energy bills. It wasn't the market wasn't working for them. Of course, in the hospitality, you've got the bar side, you've got food preparation and so on. They really do face significant costs. So I'm interested to know, perhaps starting with you, Ms. Galaza-Mullins, what do you think could be done to make the market fairer for SME sector businesses?
So I can't speak to hospitality directly, but making the market fairer, I think it's all going to have to start with better regulations around what it is currently. Again, sorry to go back to billing, but that is one of the things that a lot of small businesses do face, even with repayment options. Many of them are not given enough information about their rights, enough information of how they can have repayment plans. So knowing that information, knowing their rights and their options, I think would help go a long way. A lot of the issues that we also hear from clients when they do call, in the cases that we do get across, is that current cost for them are so high that the repayment plans that they're given are not fair enough to actually get through and make ends meet, essentially.
They're not flexible.
They're not
it's
flexible
very difficult
enough.
access to change them.
Right, correct.
Okay. Ms. Vyas.
Thank you. I think a couple of points worth making. One is around risk. Completely agree, micro businesses in particular, but also small businesses more generally, do operate more like a domestic customer, which is where third-party intermediaries or brokers come into the conversation. They play a really important role in this bit of the market. Where that works well, I think it works really well for the customer, for the supplier, and for the broker themselves. Where it doesn't work well, there could often be mistrust and issues. So when it comes to regulation, I really do think we should have closer regulation of third-party intermediaries and brokers, because it would give everyone a better outcome. Mis-selling, bad practice, pressure tactics, not necessarily. There's nothing other than some voluntary commitments in this space. So a broker has a lot of power in terms of the deal that a small business ultimately takes up. So first response is, I think third-party intermediaries, brokers, proper regulation in that space, which frankly industry and consumer groups have been calling for well over a decade now, would be really welcome. So that's one point. Coming back to the business-to-business transaction, it differs from the domestic market, because even if you had, so I think of sort of my high street, you might have a hairdresser, a bakery and a hardware store right next to one another. It literally is like that where I live. And they might have a similar footprint, but they use energy very differently. They have a different risk appetite. And so, you do need to have that tailored conversation to make sure you're getting it right for that business. So it is different to the conversation you might have with a household, it's worth noting. So managing risk and making sure you are thinking carefully about how you do that is really important. And last point, because you raised hospitality, one of the things my team are doing is working with UK Hospitality on things like the way that energy suppliers approach trade credit insurance, because we know there are things we could be doing differently and better to give a better service to small businesses that we supply. So we are trying to improve and learn from other business interactions that small businesses have.
Okay. Laurie?
I think there's a number of things to your question in terms of helping small businesses navigate the market and making the market fairer. I think there's a number of things that can be done. I think, Dara's touched on the point in terms of the regulation of TPIs. We operate our own voluntary code of conduct for brokers, where the commission that we pay to brokers is limited in the small business segment to 2 pence per kilowatt hour, where we conduct proper background checks on the directors of small businesses, the directors of TPIs, and brokers, and where we retain the right to be able to contact the business directly to make sure that that relationship cannot be circumvented if the small business needs to contact us. I think Dara's point in terms of proper regulation of TPIs, proper licensing and regulation of TPIs would be a positive. We also voluntarily apply back billing protection, which a colleague from Citizens Advice Venus was referring to. We voluntarily apply back billing protection to all small businesses, not just the micro businesses where we're obliged to do it. So we would certainly support the application of back billing protection across the whole small business segment. And actually where a small business has a smart meter, or where any customer has a smart meter for that matter, then we would support a reduction in the period of time. So back billing protection applies over a 12-month period. If a small business has a smart meter, we would support a reduction in that window of time to prevent back billing beyond 6 months. I think that would also benefit many of the micro and small businesses that we serve. I do want to come back to this point, though, in terms of the role of commercial landlords in this space. I've touched on the importance of receiving timely and accurate change of tenancy information. That is the lack of that information is the primary reason, certainly in our book, where you see small businesses remaining on deemed rates for longer than is necessary, because we simply do not have the information as to who it is who is in the building, who we are supplying, and therefore we cannot make an assessment of credit risk, we cannot make an assessment of wholesale market risk, and we cannot offer a contract. Equally, I think it would be whilst I welcome the position that the government have set out in their consultation around the future of the smart rollout and agree that for residential customers it should continue to be customer-led, I see there is no reason why smart cannot be mandated for commercially leased properties. That would significantly improve the accuracy of billing. Most of the billing issues that described earlier ultimately stem back to the use of estimated reading. Mandating smart in commercially leased properties would be a simple step that would cost the landlord nothing, would cost the small business nothing, and would improve the experience that a small business has, and then enable them to access better products and services as you start to see in the residential market.
Yes.
One question to each of you very quickly, if that's right. The energy Venus, please. So the energy ombudsman doesn't seem to have enough powers to really make changes here, and I'm wondering whether that is a factor not just in the energy market but across the country, and whether you'd like to kind of just say, would we be better off if we had one macro ombudsman with real powers and teeth, as opposed to this kind of tiny micro kind of cottage industry of ombudsmen who lack teeth? Is that kind of on target or off target?
So our organisation, Citizen Advice doesn't really have an opinion specifically on what sort of format that should take, and whether having multiple bodies or just having one massive body would help. I think a lot of the issues could be resolved within the bodies that are there now. They could be granted more powers to do things a lot better, to regulate. Obviously, our colleagues just mentioned regulating TPIs. So I think some of it, again, as I mentioned earlier, has to do with, being able to actually regulate and actually to go through that properly, but also having new powers also being granted to them.
Thank you. And if you would say one power that they particularly should have, what would it be?
Better regulating TPIs.
Okay. Chris, is it appropriate to threaten to send debt collectors to businesses while a case is being investigated by the Ombudsman?
No. If the case is being investigated by the Ombudsman and the case is live with the Ombudsman, There is a time window for the customer to go to the Ombudsman, which is 14 days from the point at which we determined that we could not resolve the complaint. Providing that the customer has done that, then we should pause all debt collection activity, and we do. If there's an instance where we fail to do that, that's on your mind, then please do let me know outside of this hearing, and we will absolutely look into it and absolutely put it right and compensate the customer if we've got it wrong. But
thank you. And Dara, Energy UK is very keen to have the UK more linked to the European single market of electrons. It makes it cheaper, more efficient, it's greener. And you are proposing putting us back inside the single day-ahead market couplings, SDAC, on a contractual basis, which is apparently doesn't require the jurisdiction of the ECJ, which is good news, I'm sure, to some. What's stopping it happening?
I just think it's down to the negotiations between government and the European Union. There's complexity within it, there's decisions that need to be made. I think the May summit was a really good starting point to kind of begin that conversation. We're really, really hopeful it will happen before the January date, the beginning of January when it's supposed to come in, because otherwise we'll see a disconnect and it will leave UK businesses out of pocket. So we need to be on the track for market coupling as soon as possible and linkage. Yeah.
Commissioner Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, on July the 1st, the Federation of Small Business told us that 19% of small businesses admit to signing an energy contract so the broker or the supplier would leave them alone and stop hassling them. So do you believe that as an industry, energy companies have done enough to challenge the practice that is bad brokers?
As I said earlier, we have implemented our own code of conduct for TPIs. There are about 3,000 brokers TPIs in the market. We only work with 182 of them as a consequence of the application of that code of conduct. I don't believe that it is ultimately for individual suppliers to regulate the TPI market. What you would have if you took that to its conclusion is different standards of practice amongst TPIs depending on which supplier was contracting with them. And I think that as Dara mentioned earlier, the TPI market should be properly licensed and properly regulated by Ofgem.
Your code of practice, I've got a copy of it in front of me. It mentions brokers acting in a professional manner, but doesn't make any comment about brokers badgering or harassing potential customers. That's the experience that I've personally had setting up my constituency office using one of the brokers that is approved on your website.
Right.
When I had 3 phone calls a day for 3 months from them asking me to sign a contract. Why is your code of practice not specifying that brokers that hassle potential customers don't deserve a place on your roll?
Well, thank you for pointing it out. It's certainly what's intended in that code of practice. If there is an example that you've got, then please do share it with me, and we'll make sure that we take the appropriate action.
Do you think that a potential way in the future to stop those bad actors that are in the market in brokers is to implement a 14-day cooling-off period for small businesses, like you do in a domestic energy contract, being able to have that for a small business as well?
That's something that we would support, yes.
And do you voluntarily, as E.ON, do that 14-day cooling-off period?
In the broker market, I'd need to come back to you and write to you with it.
It's something that you would support.
It's something that we would support, yes.
Something that if you're not at the moment, you think E.ON would potentially voluntarily start to do?
It's something that we would support, and I'll come back to you in writing.
It seems like quite a hands-off approach you're taking to TPIs, to say that it's somebody else's job to regulate them without necessarily taking some responsibility for the behaviour of the partners that you work with.
I don't agree that it's a hands-off. Respectfully, I don't agree that it's a hands-off approach. We are one of the few suppliers in the market who have introduced our own code of conduct. We cap the commission that we pay to TPIs, as I mentioned earlier, at 2 pence per kilowatt hour in the small business market. We conduct thorough due diligence and background checks on the directors and the proprietors of TPIs to make sure that that we understand the previous trading history of the partners that we're doing business with, and we ensure that in any contract that we have with a TPI, we retain the right within that contract to be able to engage with the customer directly, which is not always the case. I don't necessarily agree that the approach that we're taking is a hands-off approach, but I do believe that there is a limit to the extent to which individual energy suppliers can ultimately take the place of the regulator in regulating the TPI market. I think ultimately you have to have a common standard across the whole market that is enforced through regulation to ensure that the type of bad practice that we've heard about earlier is addressed on a market-wide basis.
So you'd presumably tell us that you think you're at the more virtuous end of the supply market in terms of the way that you ask for certain behaviours and standards amongst your TPI partners. Do you think that the behaviour that you ask for is the generally accepted norm across the sector, or is there in fact quite a wide range of bad practice?
I wouldn't pretend that we get everything right. I am pleased with the improvement of the performance we've seen with the number one large supplier in the Citizens Advice Micro Business League tables. There is more that we can absolutely do, so I wouldn't want to pretend that we get absolutely everything right. Do I believe that we are at the right end of the spectrum when it comes to TPI, the management of TPIs and the behaviour of TPIs? Yes, I do. Do I believe that there is bad practice in the TPI market? Do we see evidence of bad practice in the TPI market? Are there TPIs with whom we will not do business? Are there TPIs with whom we are involved in a litigation process related to some of those bad practices? The answer to all of that is yes. And there is more, I believe, that is required to properly license and regulate the TPI market. One of the practices that I personally feel very strongly about is where TPIs are approaching small businesses, and they're approaching small businesses effectively to try to extract money either from the small business or from the sector as a whole for services that can be provided to the small business for free by the Energy Ombudsman. That practice in particular, I believe, should be stamped out.
Thank you. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. To each of you, but I'll start with Dara, if I may. What further action would you like to see to bring down small business energy costs and improve their overall experience of the market?
Thank you for the question. I think that if you'll permit me, I'll just add a slight point to Chris's really well articulated points around brokers, in that I understand there are more than 2,000 brokers active in the space, and it's really important for the committee to recognise just how fragmented that market is. There's so many of them, and so it makes it really challenging to raise standards. It makes it really challenging to cohesively monitor performance across that space, which is another reason a sector-wide approach would be really welcome. But forgive me and thank you. But to answer your question directly, I think the first thing is about reducing electricity bills for businesses, largely through policy cost rebalancing, because it would help businesses also look to electrify heating, and it would also mean that we as a country would continue to contribute to reducing our exposure to international gas prices. So it's about business decarbonisation as well as reducing bills. The second would be expediting the way that we regulate TPIs. I think that would be a huge help for businesses across the country. And the third is more consistent support for small businesses. And the reason I say that is because support for small businesses, whilst support for large industrial users and commercial users, and the 7,000 commercial users that will get extra help through the supercharger scheme, those are all really, really important. They make us competitive internationally. So it's not to diminish the importance of supporting larger businesses, but small businesses, the help that they've had in recent years has been contingent on crisis. It has been intervening to support because of the cost of energy and the energy crisis. We need more consistent support for small businesses, and that has to be something that we work closely with government on.
Thank you. Ines.
So a few things actually. So Ofgem needs to investigate billing practices for small businesses to understand why there are such high levels of inaccurate billing in the market. Continuation of the government's plan for non-domestic smart rollout, as that current target obviously ends at the end of the year. We'd also be calling on Ofgem to work with suppliers to improve complaint handling, and lastly, include debt and disconnection in the designated activities of SLC zero, which would encourage suppliers to treat businesses fairly when they're dealing with debt. And then lastly, just banking again on more support for small businesses, especially with the net zero transition, to try to help with costs, but obviously trust in the market.
Thank you. And Chris?
I think we touched on it earlier. I think it addressed the role of marginal pricing in the wholesale price of energy, move some of the legacy policy costs off the electricity bill in particular into general taxation. Address the role address the roles and responsibilities that commercial landlords have. 60% of our small businesses are tenants in their property. In there, I think there is an opportunity as well. There's an opportunity to use the VAT system, for example. VAT is taxed at up to 20% on a business energy bill. There's the opportunity there to provide tax incentives for a small business to invest in some of the energy solutions such as solar and storage. That we do see bringing bills down significantly for the residential customers who can access them.
That would put up their business rates.
Pardon?
Would put up their business rates then.
I can't comment on that, but I believe there is an opportunity there to provide an incentive. Just to give you an example, we have a product through a partner called Loom, which enables solar sharing on mid-sized buildings. You can put that product in simply behind the meter, solar on the roof. It shares the solar output equitably with all of the tenants in that building. It allows the landlord to retain the export value of the solar, whilst the businesses potentially in that building benefit from reduced bills. That's the type of product that I'm talking about that you could incentivise through the use of the VAT that's applied to business energy bills.
Thank you.
Just so we're clear, now the gas supplies about a quarter of the UK's electricity generation. What is the logic now for tying the electricity price to the marginal price of gas?
But we would like to see that addressed, and we would like to see that changed.
What is the logic? What is the logic of persisting with that wholesale pricing model today?
You would have to ask somebody else. We believe it is the wrong thing to do. We believe that, for example, there's a report by the consultant Stonehaven, which we would absolutely support, that say by taking the gas assets out of the wholesale market into a strategic reserve or a regulated asset base, you can save energy customers, residential business energy customers in the UK, up to £2 billion per year. There is no reason to my mind as to why we should persist with marginal pricing where the most expensive molecule sets the price for the whole market and customers do not benefit from what is normally cheaper renewable power.
Do you think that's a shared view across your industry?
I don't believe it is, no, but that's our view.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just follow up on that,
please,
if I may, Chris? So, E.ON operates across Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, I'm not expecting you necessarily to have a perfect answer on this, but is there a regulatory environment across Europe where you're like, well, actually, I think they've got it right, and they're not using the marginal price of gas to price electricity, and that you hear about as being a sensible model?
I think it would be better for the to help the committee with your inquiry, for me to write to you with full comparators of the individual European markets in which we operate and what's driving the bill. We'll definitely do that.
Mr. Weston.
Just finally, if I could, Mr. Norbury, and then maybe Mr. Vyas as well, just on the TPI element of the business and with SMEs, I'm just interested to know, because this is something that I've obviously missed a trick on, but say 10 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, what proportion of your business to SMEs would that have been fed through that market, through TPI?
Well, I would have to come back to you in writing of 10, 20 years ago. It's
just a gut
but
feel.
If today, 20% of the small businesses with whom we contract is that is a relationship through a TPI. So it's 20% today
of SMEs.
Of SMEs, and that has reduced over time. I couldn't go back to 10, 20 years ago.
Do you have a feel for it?
I don't, but just on my personal experience, I used to work at Citizens Advice, and back in 2010 and onwards, we were calling for regulation of the brokers market because we could see then what an impact that relationship was having on customers getting the best deal or not. So I think it's been an issue for quite some time.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. That's been extremely helpful. Very grateful to you. That concludes this panel. Order. Well, welcome to this third panel in today's inquiry session on small business in the UK. Mr. Lohman, perhaps I could begin with you. The stories that we have heard from businesses around the country basically paint a picture of crime being completely out of control on our high streets. Is that what your members are telling you?
In some places, in some instances, that is true. And I think we've seen that shop theft is not a new thing. But what we have seen really change in recent years is the brazenness, the lack of any regard for consequences that we feel many thieves have. So you have instances of shelves just being cleared, people just walking in and walking out, no attempt to hide what they're doing. That is relatively new behaviour, certainly to the extent that we're seeing it now. There are examples I'm sure we'll get onto about some good initiatives and some good progress in tackling those things, but it is the number one issue facing our members, both the cost of the crime, which amounts to a 10p crime tax on every single transaction. So if you added up all the cost of crime and developed by all the transactions in the convenience store sector, it comes to a 10 pence tax that we're all paying for every time we go to the shops. The personal impact, the human impact on people working in stores and running stores. And then mindful, this is a business and trade committee, the business impact that has in areas like recruitment, retention, colleague morale, and obviously the viability of that business faced with all those very significant costs and investment demands.
Mr. Morris, what are your members telling you about just the way things have changed over the last few years?
I think you sort of look back over the last 10 years, which is when the problems seem to tick up, really. So when around 2016, around half of our members were telling us that they were abused as part of the job.
Half of your members were telling you that they had been abused as part of the job.
At that point in 2016, and that was the lower end of where we are now. So that sort of went up to 2/3 by 2019. And then the pandemic happened, and whole-scale abuse right across the sector. It went up to well over 90%. And then since the pandemic, it's come back down. And last year, the figure was 77%. But that's 77% for last year. 77% of our members were abused just as a result of going to work. And then to look sort of the similar figures for physical assaults, it was around 2% back in 2016. That went up to around 5% in 2019. It got up to 18% last year, so 1 in 5 were physically assaulted just simply as a result of going about the job, and it has fallen back to 10% last year, which we will get onto those sort of initiatives that James was just mentioning that have sort of helped to tackle that a bit. But to say 10% and that's an improvement, it's still 1 in 10 retail workers who are getting assaulted just simply as a result of going to work.
Thank you very much indeed just for setting that out. Mr. Poynton.
Thank you. I mean, as the chairman said, the impact is huge. I've been to Waz's in Broxburn, a convenience store, or Scotmid and Dean's, or Boots in the centre, and they've all told me. So these are different types of businesses, different sizes of businesses that are having a huge impact on their businesses. Mr. Lohman, would you just describe for me what impact this is having on your members and the businesses that they run?
It's a generally business critical thing for our members. There is that cost, and there's the cost of the crime itself, the losses, which in some cases are very, very significant and enough to push a business from profitability into a loss making. When you add to that then the cost of security measures in the store, which had to be constantly updated, constantly changed to try and tackle the latest way that people are stealing from the store. That adds another significant impediment to the viability and profitability of that business. But as I say, I think there's also the human element, and I think that when Chris describes those violent incidents, I think you had to put yourself in the position of someone who's been the victim of that, who's then gone home that night and told their family and may have reached a conclusion, well, I don't want to go back and work in that store. That's something which their family think they ought not to do. And now that we still have 443,000 people working in convenience, most of whom do get through their day, safely. But these incidents are far too many, and it affects recruitment, it affects retention, and it affects morale among the people who are working there. So it's a human issue, and it's a really powerful business issue as well. And this matters, obviously, because our members want to trade and run businesses that can be profitable. But if you think about the services that are offered through our members' stores, things like post offices, parcel collection points, prescription collections in some cases, we're often the only thing that's left in that housing estate or that village. And so, yes, there's a business threat and impact there, but the service provision implications of that are really serious for the wider community, as well as the provision of food and all the other things that we sell.
Lawrence, would you add to that?
Yeah, I think in terms of sort of the personal impact, you've generally got two types of, or a very broad generalisation of the two types of criminals. There's those who are struggling with addiction, and there's those who are in organised crime gangs, and these are for kind of prolific offenders. And in both categories, they can be incredibly violent. So someone who's struggling with addiction wants to go into a store, get as much as they can, and make sure they get out before they start having a need for whatever their addiction is kicks in, and they will go in with all sorts of weapons and needles and other measures to make sure they get out. And then when it's organised crime gangs, you're talking of multiple people that go into a retail outlet, and we've agreed policies with retailers now across the board that shop workers shouldn't intervene in those instances. If someone comes in intent on violence, then it's not up to the shop worker to put their own health at risk, which I think is the right policy. But we do get comments from members that has a mental health impact in terms of feeling so powerless to be able to stop these sorts of incidents happening. So one other thing that we do is we provide an assault at work grant. So when our members are assaulted, if they can't get the compensation for that through the criminal injuries compensation scheme, then there's an Ulster scheme that will support those workers. And some of the reports of incidents that we get there, people who are sort of stabbed with a screwdriver is one we've seen recently, and other real serious efforts of people treating shop workers completely with disregard, just to make sure that they can get whatever the goods are and walk out.
What are you writing?
Thank you. Yeah, much like Gregor, in the recess I was out talking to businesses on my high street, and one thing that really shocked me is they said how little they actually call the police, because they don't have trust that the police will come in time, or if they do, they won't necessarily respond quick enough or effectively enough to catch the thief. So, Superintendent, if we can start with you, why do you think that is, and what needs to change to bring back that confidence in the police and retail crime?
I think there's a couple of elements to it. So I think we moved away from community policing, at a time when everything was a focus. Not that long ago we were talking solely about VOG, we were talking about robbery, burglary, and I think shoplifting fell off policing agenda is my personal view. I can't say I speak for every police officer, but certainly that's my view. I think there has been some perception issues and lack of confidence in policing. There have been several high-profile cases that have really diminished that confidence, and that's hard to get back. But I think some of that confidence...
Unpack that a little bit. I didn't quite follow your
I think
answer.
So you talk about some of the high-profile cases in the Met, for example, of officers who have been convicted of murder and rape and all these kind of things, and there was a real perception that police should have done more, should have known about, and I think it just has damaged policing's reputation. I feel that very much, particularly as a female officer. It's been a tough few years. It's not a profession that I feel as proud of as I did when I joined 24 years ago, because there's lots of negative connotations around the role, and that's incredibly sad. But I think as well there is some bits that policing needs to do to educate, in terms of you don't need a police officer to actually physically turn up to get a response or an investigation. We have digital evidence management systems now whereby when a crime is reported, we can send a link and they can upload the CCTV and a statement, That has some real positives in terms of it can be done by a security operations centre, so it takes the fear of repercussions in the community away from those retail workers. But it also, the negative side is that if people don't actually physically see a police officer, and perhaps their manager or the security operations centre is getting the update on the crime, the person in the shop just thinks that we haven't attended and we don't care, and they perhaps don't know. So I think we need to educate people a lot more that we don't have to actually physically be there. But yeah, I appreciate, and I've done a lot of work in the last couple of years really just trying to build those relationships back up again, because that is what it comes down to. But some of it is, particularly if it's a very small business, if you're taking somebody out off the shop floor, to do a statement or to produce CCTV, that's time consuming, that's extra work that they can't afford or money is spent. And there's also the sort of concern about what's the negative impact then coming back on me if I've reported to police, the knock-on effect, particularly I think in your sector where those convenience stores are thoroughly embedded in the community and they live and work in the same close vicinity.
That mirrors what I'm hearing from businesses in my constituency. But one thing they also said, so you spoke about the if they have CCTV footage or private security, is a concern that the smaller businesses, the independent businesses that might not be able to afford to have that sort of private system are therefore at higher risk. How do you think we can level that out so it isn't the independent businesses that might not have that are being hit by retail crime?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of major retailers that don't have very good CCTV, so it's not, it's not always about cost and how they choose to spend their money. And it can be a small standalone system in that store, and officers can still attend and take the CCTV on a disc or a USB stick, like we've done for years. But we prefer to do it digitally. It saves that original copy. It's viewable instantly. So that really, really helps. But appreciate that does come at a cost.
Finally, do you think within the police force there's this feeling that retail crime is a low-level crime? Is that a cultural feeling? Or?
I think culturally it was. I think, in the last couple of years, a lot of things have changed, largely due to the escalating levels of violence and threats and assaults. I think people realise it's not just shoplifting anymore, and that is the Home Office classification, and that's what it is by law, but I always prefer to call it retail crime because for that very reason, I think sometimes shoplifting can have a negative connotation. But it's frustrating as well for police officers because when they see that they're locking the same people up week after week and they're not getting into the courts or they're not getting any kind of sentence or diversion, then that's frustrating for them as well. So I don't think it all comes from sort of laziness or not wanting to do it. I think some of it comes from frustration also.
Thank you.
And some of the polling I published last night showed that 48% of people in our country think that their area is in decline. And when we give people the opportunity to explain why, overwhelmingly, the two words that they use are crime and shops. Do you think that within the harm reduction matrices that most forces now use, retail crime is anywhere like close enough to the top of the list?
I definitely think it's gone up the list, and I definitely think it's better. I can speak quite knowledgeably. I've been the London lead in the Met for the last sort of 2.5 years and have just taken on this national role for the last 3 months. So I can talk quite confidently there about the impact that has on people, but also from my own high street and the impact of the boots being cleared out and the electric doors being shut so that people can't come in and out as quickly by the makeup aisle. So I do think it's a very real concern, but I do think retail crime is better understood now than it has been probably for a long time.
Over the last 3 months, have you been having conversations with police commanders up and down the country? They've got a lot of problems on their plate.
Yep.
They don't have enough resources.
Yep.
Recruitment of neighbourhood police teams is behind schedule. I mean, what are the kind of sentiments that they express to you when you come along and say, hey, look, do you know what, everyone, you need to think harder about retail crime?
Yeah. So we had a big launch of the Tackling Retail Crime Strategy on the 14th of July. And it was launched by Dame Diana Johnson, and we had a really fairly even split from across the country of policing, retail and academics. And there are some pockets of some really good work, and some of that does come down to money and resourcing. Some of it comes down to the individuals and the PCCs, getting that vision. But there is some really good work on, and part of my job is really just to standardise that best practice and share it across the country to try and bring that all together.
For a frontline police commander, how would you characterise how they currently now think about this as a priority?
I think the priority is coming back to the neighbourhood policing guarantee, coming back to community-style policing, because shops are an absolutely integral part of the shop of the local community. Like James said earlier, if you take a shop out of a community and you've got nowhere to cash your pension check and buy your daily paper, there's a real lack of community there without a shop. So I do think return to community policing and the neighbourhood policing guarantee has got a large part to say in that. But that obviously comes at a cost of getting those neighbourhood policing officers in the right place.
Is it by and large a top 5 issue for a local police commander?
I don't think top 5, I would say top 10.
Okay, Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to go back to the point about the perception of policing in the modern day and how the police can better communicate what you are doing. You talked about the CCTV at the station and digital solutions. The general public don't understand any of that. No. And so confidence and the fear that people feel about going into their communities, and certainly in Bognor Regis and Littlehampton, in those communities people are concerned at times about going into town centres. But if they don't know what else is going on behind the scenes, then how can we improve that confidence? I suppose my question to you is, what will the police do to improve that communication?
So, news stories and policing never sell. They don't make front pages of the papers, and I've worked in roles before in neighbourhoods, and you try to push good news stories and work that you do, and it's incredibly difficult to get media attention on this. As part of the launch of the Tackling Retail Crime Together strategy, we've launched a communication kit and a branding kit to really get everybody talking about it.
You need to talk a bit slower, sorry.
Sorry. So a branding kit of everybody policing consistently across the country, and retailers and business improvement districts, business crime reduction partnerships, all using this same branding to show they're working together. And the hope is that some of that will deter offenders if they think everybody's working together a lot more efficiently. There's a greater chance of them getting caught, and no criminal wants to be caught. But communication and getting good news stories out of policing has been probably the bane of my career. It's incredibly difficult to get the media interested in that, and you can get pockets of your community interested through safer neighbourhood panels and local events. But what I've always found, and in my experience, is that you will get the same group of people come to those meetings and you're not catching the wider public. So I don't know is the answer to that question. I think repetition.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Chair. Lisa, you just mentioned the sort of the neighbourhood policing guarantee and a little bit on the sort of safer streets mission. Do you think it's enough to tackle high street retail crime?
If it's resourced properly. If policing is resourced and has the money and the visibility, policing physically in neighbourhoods, then yes.
Do you think you are resourced currently, or do you think you will be resourced once? What do you think is required? What's the vision? What do you think, if this could be the gold standard, what would that be?
I'm a superintendent. I don't run a police force, but if I did, I would think the numbers to ensure that I have visibility on every high street every day would be the gold standard. Will we ever get there? I don't know. But I think the return to mindset that that's what we need is there now. But now we just need the numbers and the resources to go behind it.
I think a number of, having also gone to the town centres and spoken to lots of businesses on the high street in Dudley, what people say, they do see a police officer, but as soon as there's an incident, that police officer's now taken up by another one, so 2 of them have now gone, and that might they leave the whole entire day with no actual visible policing, and that just happens if that incident happens in the morning, then there's no policing for the whole day. So do you see that actually it's not just the fact that visibility, what's now happening is because there's no visibility of police officers on the ground, a lot of small businesses are now investing in having an extra security, having CCTV, and according to the ACES, they're saying that it's costing just over £5,000 for each business to invest into trying to make sure that their business is secure, and they're not spending hours and hours and hours of one having to chase the police officers and then their crime numbers and then trying to get those people prosecuted.
You're absolutely right. If an officer arrests somebody at the beginning of their shift, then that custody process and preparing a case file, or getting the CCTV, getting the statement, whatever it may be, does take time. There's no getting away from that. You can't prosecute without it. The ways that retailers can help is by having the CCTV that's readily available and somebody there who can actually make it available to the police officer straight away. Because if the suspect gets bailed, then you're in the position where they're bailed, they're straight back out committing further offences, and that case is just building and building, and it's going to take longer to that the police officers off the street. So we need retailers to be confident and give us statements and give us CCTV as soon as possible. So every time somebody's arrested, we're evidentially ready to go.
And I'm going on the back of this, Chris, what do you think needs to happen, whether it's at local level or whether it's sort of looking at how we can support small businesses and working in partnership with them to try and make sure their businesses are secure? What do you think we should be doing?
How to make sure the business parts
are like secure, whether it's the CCTV support, or like giving them additional grant or funding for CCTV, or making them more aware of like how to get staff training, and that could be from the business, from a local government point of view, or it could be a national strategy. What do you think needs to be done?
I think there's a whole range of measures that can be taken, and we've seen some in the crime and policing bill with the specific offence of assaulting a retail worker and the presumption then, if you're found guilty of that offence, that you'll get a criminal behaviour order, which can then, if people aren't sentenced to prison, then that can ensure that the person is taken off the street or taken away from those retailers. I think what also needs to be done is some amount of simplifying the processes. That's sort of what Lisa was talking about earlier, in terms of when a retailer wants to report an issue for a national retailer, or particularly, then they're looking at 42, 43 different police forces, all with slightly different reporting procedures, and trying to streamline that process and make sure that there is quite a simplified process which would encourage people to actually report. At the moment, one of the barriers to reporting is the length of time it takes and the complication in terms of being able to do that. So making sure that reporting rates rise, that will help the police in identifying where they need to respond to. I think there's the question of resourcing of the police as well. We've seen the anecdotal evidence and the suggestions from our survey evidence are that the level of physical assaults went down following the implementation of the National Retail Crime Action Plan, which prioritised attendance for retail crime and incidents where a worker had been assaulted, where there was evidence that needed to be gathered, or where someone had been detained by the shop. And those things, as a start of a priority, has helped to tackle some level of retail crime, but we need to make sure that the resources are there to drive it down even further than where we are now. And what else we've seen in local areas is retailers coming together with local authorities and metropolitan areas to be able to tackle it as a community and figure out what are the best things, how do they best utilise the police force in the local area, and how can they share best practice amongst themselves. So we've seen some really good initiatives in Oldham, in North Manchester, where retailers are coming together to try and tackle it as a community issue there alongside the police and alongside the local authority, and I think that can really help.
We'll just bring in Joshua Reynolds on that point.
Thank you, Chair. In 24-25, 800 shoplifting incidents a day went unsolved, 18% increase since the year before. What made that 18% increase, do you think? Why is it still going up?
I don't know why it's going up, but I think part of it, and I can't speak to the figures exactly, but is the volume in reporting. So we've really, really pushed and actively asked retailers to report. Partly because the ONS data up to the end of March said that retail crime had gone up to 530,000 offences. Now, we know that that's nowhere near what's actually happening. That's actually just what's being reported. For policing, to get those resources and police officers and all those things that we've already discussed. To get those, I have to show that there's a problem, and I need the data from the retailers to really identify the problem. A, the scale of retail crime. B, where are my high harm places within the country, and who are my prolific offenders. And if a police force, Chief Constable level or Town Centre team PC level knows that information, then I think they're better placed to deal with it. So we've definitely pushed for reporting. We've changed some things to try and make reporting a bit easier, because some of our traditional methods online have not been very friendly to businesses, so they are very much kitted out for individuals. So Lisa Maslin, who may report one crime a year, to somebody who works on a convenience store on a high street who's reporting 10 a week. So we've tried to simplify processes and try to help make reporting less of a barrier and less time consuming. So I hope that's driven the numbers up.
So in terms of reporting, I spent years working in grocery stores and would report on disk 3 or 4 times a day, every day for multiple years. But from those reports on disk, I probably only saw or heard from an officer 5 times over 3 years. That doesn't give confidence for me or the team that worked for me to continue reporting these incidents. So how can we give confidence to these store teams that actually they're doing the right thing, they are reporting it, but they're not hearing or seeing, and then they're still seeing their same shoplifters, the ones that are in 2 or 3 times a day every day, often at the same times each day as well, they're still seeing them come in, so they know that nothing's actually happening off the back of it.
It's an external platform, and it's one that many retailers use to record their stock loss or to record their incidents or to record their crimes. It doesn't directly link into police reporting, so because an incident's loaded onto that or any of the other platforms, will not necessarily go straight to policing.
Is the police and crime commissioners are asking stores to use disk, saying that it will feed in?
Parts of the country, not everywhere. So I think one of the challenges I've often had is exactly that conversation. Somebody said, well, I've reported it on one of the platforms and the police didn't attend. It's because it doesn't come through to police. Now, in some areas, police will have an information sharing agreement with the provider of disk in that area, be it their business crime reduction partnership, etc. But in others, that data will be purely used by the retailer. It won't ever make it to the police. So, and this is another one of my real challenges, is, there's 3 or 4 really big ones who are monopolising, and it's a little bit like policing. If you're going to design it today on a blank piece of paper, you wouldn't put every police force on a different crime recording standard, a digital evidence management system. Retailers have the prerogative to choose which platform they want to use and which CCTV manufacturer installer, and actually collating all of that and bringing all of that together in one place is incredibly challenging.
So what role do you think it is then for the government to be able to bring that together to make sure that every incident that is reported on disk, you say some forces will go directly, but others won't. How do we bring everyone in line so all of those incidents that stores are reporting, they're doing the right thing, go to the police, and then stores will actually see outcomes off the back of it?
So there is some work going on at the moment with the team in the Home Office looking at certain platforms. We could remember it's very complicated around data, because the retailer owns the data, then you've got a third party, intermediary, for want of a better phrase, taking that data and then either cleansing it or putting it into a usable format to give to police. So it becomes very complicated around data protection, around what's clear, what's accurate. Some of these platforms use AI or facial rec and things in the background as well, so there's lots to work around there in policing terms around how we integrate them, and then you have to integrate all of those platforms into every police force's crime recording system.
Is it just too complicated?
I think it's doable. I think it will take investment, and I think it will require some level of standardisation, but those tech, whether it be CCTV or platforms, they are all competitors in their own market, which makes it incredibly challenging to get people around the table.
Maynard.
Thank you, Superintendent, and also with you, please. So I've just done a PCSO shift in Witney and Carterton. Impressed by lots that I saw. The CCTV systems are very good. knowledge of key perpetrators is very good. Where it gets much stickier and to a point of deep depression of everybody in town knows it's, this guy or that guy or whoever, or girl or whoever it may be doing it, and they're doing it exactly as Josh says, time after time after time, day after day after day, and that whole aspect around solving that problem, getting statements and actually following through and coming up with a sensible solution for those perpetrators, and the incredibly negative feedback loop back into the high street and the community of this just not being dealt with. And so just from the kind of, let's assume DISC worked perfectly, which it doesn't, we recognise, but let's say it did. Just could you say a bit more about that back end in terms of insight within police control, in terms of that, locking up courts, sentencing? What would you say are the biggest problems at that end that need to be addressed? Because the front end largely is known.
I think there's a lack of deterrent. I think that is the biggest challenge. One of the things Chris mentioned there is around, a lot of stores now have a policy of not detaining. I personally agree with that, given the levels of violence. As a police officer, you're expected to deal with the right kit and the right people around you, but, working in a convenience store with possibly one other person, absolutely not. So I think they know there's no deterrent from actually anybody physically grabbing hold of them and detaining them. And then I think if they do get to the courts, the sentence is minimal. I think there's a lack of understanding around what is a prolific offender. So a prolific offender doesn't have to be, or the offender that's causing the most harm in shops doesn't have to be the person who's taking the £1,000 telly. They could be going in every day and taking £10, and this is what's really challenging. As a police officer, the chance of me being in the same location if I'm assaulted today, tomorrow, is minimal. But if you're working in Boots on your high street, then that person's going to... And some people have said to me they can set their watch by them, the time they'll come back in. And I think it's incredibly difficult for policing to get a batch of cases, which is almost what you need, to show the severity and the recidivism of these offenders to the courts, or to get it through CPS to get it to the courts. But it doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes it could be one arrest for one, and then people say, well, it's £10. Yeah, but it's been £10, but it's been every day. And the levels of sort of abuse and threats, either intimidating, intimating weapons, or actually physically showing them.
And as far as you would like to say, what would be good to see between the police and the CPS to see this change and improve? What would be the...
I would like to see... Lisa would like to see the CPS actually take shoplifting as seriously as we are trying to take it, and that if we can get these people in front of the courts, that actually there's meaningful sentences. Or for those that require support, who are offending to fund a habit, then actually that there's a more holistic approach to them. I feel that's hit and miss. Some areas are very good at that, and a lot of that depends on sort of third-party organisations. But I think when you think of the overall cost of funding, particularly drug rehabilitation, is minimal when you think how much they're stealing every day to fund it.
Just one more question on the system failure that you've described here. So we also heard evidence from people who wanted to see police officers going in alongside trading standards, alongside HMRC, alongside UK Border Agency. I mean, that sounds to me like a multi-agency task force in which no one is in charge. So how often do you see those kind of joint initiatives? Who should be in charge? And what do we need to do to make sure we have more of that kind of policing?
I don't think they happen as often as they used to. There used to be a lot more, particularly with sort of trading standards at a local level, and that was very much community information and intelligence led. That if somebody is selling something that is branded to another store, that kind of thing, then trading standards and police would work on that, but that would be intelligence led. And likewise, the border force issues, and if you're looking at, are people organised gangs, a lot of them will run sort of, perhaps children that are being exploited. So, there's lots of crossover with other government agencies, and I think you're right, I don't think that is being looked at, and who should own that? I don't know.
Unclear.
Probably above my pay grade.
Thank you, Mark.
And this is for you, Lisa. So everyone knows who the frequent flyers are. It's what some people, whether you want to brand them, and what you want to call people that continuously shoplift time and time again. So the traders will know this, the businesses will know it, the police will know it, and these people just going round in a circle, and it is just like a merry-go-round, and no one actually manages to get to a point of them getting prosecuted. What do you think needs to happen? What do you see happening in the future to actually build those relationships with businesses, and actually intelligence to be shared wider across? Because everyone knows, but sometimes people aren't having those conversations or feel like they're able to have those conversations. Do you think there needs to be a platform or some sort of meeting or something like that? Because I know in some parts of the country there are forums that are set up for this, while others there's just desert and there's nobody talking at all. So what do you see as a sort of gold standard? And on the back of that, what preventative things should we be doing? Because we're talking about sort of the prosecutions, but what preventive work do you think needs to be happening?
Yeah. So I think probation have a big part to play in this. If we're talking about keeping people out of prisons, I think probation have a big part to play in pulling actually a multi-agency together to actually make sure that we are collecting all of that. Obviously the probation is after they've been sort of arrested or what have you, but I do think that's probably the most natural place for those repeat offenders who are constantly being arrested and going through the court system. In terms of, is it housing? Is there issues with the children, school, health, mental health trust, all those kind of things? I think a full multi-agency approach there for some of our offenders would actually really help. In terms of prevention, I could prevent retail crime tomorrow because I could make every shop look like an Argos, and that would be great. But it's not a customer journey that people want to experience, nor should we have to. So I think there is a real balance to be had. Some retailers can definitely do more, but then they're already investing in RFID tags, they're investing in DNA sprays, they're investing in CCTV, locked cabinets, all that kind of thing. So some retailers are very good at investing all of that, generally the ones that are larger and have the money and the outlet to do that. But I think for smaller retailers, that's incredibly challenging to ask them to do that kind of prevention. Policing officer designing out crime support. There's lots of crime prevention on the National Business Crime website, but there is a balance to be had for the one who's going to actually spend money in the shop and us having a nice experience in that store. So it's a difficult one. Like I say, I could prevent it all tomorrow, but it's...
James, just on the back of that, what do you think needs to be done to help small businesses sort of distribute that burden? Who do you think should be giving that support to small businesses to prevent crime?
Yeah, I think we should look at ways we can help retailers to make those investments. That might be grants, it might be incentivising that investment, or taking away some of the disincentives. So if you install CCTV and other measures in your store, your valuation for the premises might go up, so your business rates bill might go up, which is the exact opposite of surely what I think anyone will want to happen. So I'm thinking about how we can, whether it's through the business rate system or through the tax system, ways of incentivising that investment. Maybe it's a super deduction on crime prevention measures or something like that. The biggest incentive around prevention is that confidence, and Superintendent Maslin is right. There are complexities. It's also very simple. It's also very simple that retailers need to report crime, police need to investigate it, and the courts need to implement effective penalties. And I think while we have to embrace the complexity, then there are complexities in there. It is as simple as that, and I think that only works when there's everyone's doing their part in terms of those parts, but also there's feedback through that. And what I hear from members a lot of the time is, I reported through the online system, and ultimately whatever the system is, ultimately the police get to see that and they can investigate that on that basis. But I didn't hear anything back. Nothing seemed to happen. So the same people kept coming in, and so they don't bother to do it the next time. So you have to really work to keep that retailer reporting, because otherwise you miss that first link in the chain. And I think Superintendent Masden's right as well when she talks about the CPS and about cases coming to court. But where it's successful, where we hear great success, is that when you have 30, 40 cases associated with that incident, associated with that individual in that one case, that can lead to a meaningful penalty, whether that's at custodial centres or whether it is intervention, rehabilitation, community orders. And I think we're agnostic about what's the best way to do it. The objective is to break the cycle of reoffending, however that's done. And at the moment, if the crime's not being reported and not investigated, we haven't got a chance. There's no possibility of doing that. So, we are a long way, and I think there is complexity, but I think you've got to keep it simple as well.
Okay, Matt Weston.
Just briefly on that, perhaps, certainly businesses, my constituency at work in Leamington, corner shops, convenience stores, all speak to that, saying that please just extend the relief on, say, adding in CCTV and other equipment. Things like facial recognition systems, I'm not sure how legal that is presently, but perhaps you can explain to me on that. But just one thing I was struck by, and that was a story in the papers just the other day of a garage owner, petrol station forecourt owner in Romford, who said that they'd lost £30,000 worth of fuel over the last 4 years, and have had to install £13,000 worth of CCTV. Surely the time has now come, really, for this to be very much standardised and enabled through such relief as you're describing.
Absolutely. I think that when you get into drive-offs in certain parts of the country, it can be very intense. We call drive-offs, so people fill up their car with fuel, and almost always those incidents are linked to other crime as well, by the way. So CCTV, automatic number plate recognition, can be very helpful, particularly as a lot of those vehicles are stolen. Yep. And so it can, and this is with those crimes, and actually with all the crimes we're talking about, there is another way of looking at this as well. I think traditionally we've seen it as such a high volume set of crimes that it's always been too difficult to get our arms around and tackle. We can look at it the other way and say this is an incredible data source on the individuals who are blighting communities up and down the country. And if we identify the repeat shop thieves, well, there are also people burgling houses, they're also stealing cars, they're also stealing fuel. So to see that as a way of identifying those people, I think if we see it as in that way, we might be able to make more progress rather than just thinking, is this almost impossible tide to hold back? I don't believe that's the case. I think it can be tackled, and I think we need to look at it differently.
You said there was it was basically a 10p tax, is that right?
Yes.
And Chris, I think you said it's half of shop workers have now had some kind of abuse.
70, so it was half. It's 77% last year. Yeah.
So look, just to draw this to a close, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. I mean, the story that you've described today is that business crime is now so expensive it's equivalent to a 10p tax. You've got over 3/4 of shop workers who have now experienced some kind of abuse. Business crime is not a top 3 or a top 5, it's possibly a top 10 issue for police around the country. You said that there was not sufficient policing resource in place at the moment to tackle this crisis. There is a failure of leadership on the front line and a system crisis that characterises this problem, and that is contributing to an overwhelming failure of confidence in how we're going to tackle this. So that is quite a bleak picture, but thank you for being very candid with us today and making sure that evidence is on the record. That concludes this panel. That concludes this session. Order.